Hello everybody, ScorchArtist's back again with yet another video. This is the second to last video. I think I said in my last video, but that wasn't actually true. This is my second to last video in my 5-part video series on how to analyze comic books so that you can figure out really what works and what doesn't work, so you can maximize your chances of putting the things that do work into your own comic books and, you know, make awesome comic books. So this is going to be largely based off of Scott McCloud's Making Comics Books first chapter. If you haven't read that whole entire book, it's a comic book. It's about making comic books. It's really, really awesome. I suggest you check it out. But his first chapter, he talks about basically the ways to achieve clarity. He goes over some specific aspects you want to pay attention to. And this video is going to be all about your choice of word. Your choice of word is these things. It's your dialogue, it's your word balloons, it's your bubbles, it's all those words that are going to be in a panel in your comic book, basically explaining things more than the pictures can actually explain them, or communicating things between your subjects in your panel. So we're going to see a little bit of that here, and I'm basically going to be showing you a little bit of some examples of what choice of word is and how it works, and what things to go for and what things to avoid, and when you are deciding to put words on your page. So let's hop right into it. This is a 10-page comic that was submitted for a contest, so it has a lot of a contest a while back, but it has a lot of things that work and a lot of things that don't work because it's very amateur. So I'm going to show you all the things that work and the things that don't work. So very first thing we're going to go here is your choice of word, meaning your word balloons. Now, what about your word balloons? Your word balloons, you kind of want to think of them as the most important thing on your page is going to be your image. Always. It's always going to be your image. At least in my opinion, I think it's always the image, because I'll go into that in a second, but basically your image is the comic book, right? You should be able to communicate things primarily through your image, meaning that if the majority of the words were cut out, you should get a general idea of what's happening here. Like, you should be able to see that this person's transferring this camera to this guy, and he's not happy, and he's not holding a camera, and he's walking away, and then now he's curious. But you should be able to tell that mostly just by the images. The words help, but you shouldn't depend on them as a crutch. What happens is when you depend on words as a crutch, you tend to put too many words because you're trying to explain everything, and it gets kind of static and not realistic. So the very first thing here we're going to talk about is your choice of word balloon and how it affects your panel. So your word balloon and your picture, you want to think of your word balloon kind of like a ninja, right? Your word balloon's kind of like this ninja, right, in the background, and he's like hiding from the actual page, right? Because your readers should not really know that the word balloon is there. Obviously, they can read the word balloon, they see it's there, but the word balloon shouldn't be doing anything that is intrusive on the pictures. The reader should just be reading it, right? And go through the word balloons and, you know, go read everything. They should never stop and go, why is this word balloon in this particular space? Or that word balloon is really oddly placed, or that's really oddly shaped. It's really, you know, distracting from the panel, right? The reader should see the word balloon, but not really be conscious of the word balloon. It shouldn't ever make its appearance in the comic book. It should be like they're hearing things in the background. So what happens is, let's say you had this page right here, right, and you had this word balloon. Oh, thanks. Now, I could have put this word balloon anywhere. I could have put this word balloon a little bit 2 feet higher. It could have been right here instead, or it could have been 2 feet lower. It could have been right here instead. And when you're making your word balloons, you really want to think about, okay, is this word balloon distracting from anything on the page? Is this word balloon intruding on any important information? And if it is, if your word balloon is intruding on important information, then you know you need to move it. And why do you need to move it? You need to move it because if it's in front of important information, the reader's going to notice that, because they're going to want to see the important information, maybe this person's face, but now there's a word balloon in the way, and they're very confused. So you'll see in a lot of amateur comic books, many artists will tend to put word balloons in really odd places. Like, they'll put a word balloon directly over a character who like one character's talking to another character, and there's a word balloon directly over the other character's face, and it's like, whoa, that's really odd that you would decide to put that there, seeing that you have this entire box, you can place it anywhere. So it really shows a lack of creativity, and not like in a horrible lack of creative person, but it just shows a lack of attempt at really understanding the reader's experience when it comes to reading your comic book. So definitely think of your word balloons as like ninjas who are kind of floating around but aren't ever really getting in the way. So you can see this as maybe it's getting in the way here, but the focus isn't really on this character's expression or on this character's back. It's really on what this character is saying and what this character is doing. So then when I go here where the focus is on this person's face, the word balloon is nowhere, it's like, you know, it's down here. It's not really intruding on any important information. You can also use your word balloons to cover up information. So maybe you want to have more of a focus on the main character here, right? You can use your word balloons like I did here, not really consciously, kind of just put them there, but you really want to be aware. It's like, okay, so if I put these word balloons here, what are they doing to the overall composition, right? Are these word balloons taking away or adding to the composition? If I had them down here, there'd be a word balloon here, a word balloon here, then you would see a picture here, and you would see this character here, right? And would that really help me communicate anything? All right, well, would it be better if I blocked those images out entirely so that the focus is kind of just on this character? Be aware of what your word balloons are doing and try to get really creative with how you lay them on the page. Now, there's no set defined, you know, this is how word balloons have to be, but I'm talking more of a general, you know, Western or mainstream comic book manga style, meaning that you're just telling a story and you're not doing anything super experimental. Obviously, if you're like an experimental comic book artist, you know, do what you want with your word balloons. You could have them, you know, directly interacting with your images. But if that's not what you're going for, you don't want them to be directly interacting with your images. You don't want any interaction with your images at all. They should just not even be there. So another thing too is to keep in mind your word balloons, they guide the reader across the page. So the word balloons are places of interest. So the reader goes from word balloon to word balloon, and then they go through the images, but they stick to the general word balloons, right? You control the choice of flow with where you decide to put the word balloons. And you really want to be aware of how you're placing word balloons. I'm pretty sure we've all come across a comic book where, let's say, the word balloons, you reach a panel and the word balloons are kind of weirdly placed, and you're not really sure which one to go to first. So maybe you read the one on the bottom first. We think maybe that's where that one's supposed to be. And obviously there's a certain reading. You want to understand that readers read, you know, from left to right in Western society. So they'll start from the top and go down. But if you're not aware of that and you just place them kind of like even areas where you're not really paying attention to how the reader is seeing the actual word balloon, you may end up placing a word balloon in a place that really distracts from the overall image in the panel. So they might go to that word balloon and go, wait, am I reading this first? Am I reading that first? And then they read everything backwards, and it really pulls them out of the story. You really want to have your readers deep into the story and avoid everything that can pull them out of the story. So keep in mind of what you're doing with the word balloons and where they're taking the image, where they're taking the reader's eye, and how they're pulling it across the page and whatnot. Another thing too is you want to get creative with your word balloons. So so laggy. All right, so you really want to get creative with your word balloons, and that is, let's say you have a page where somebody has to relay a lot of information. Maybe they're talking about something that has to be kind of specific for the reader to understand what's happening. One thing that people do is they'll do. I wish I had my water over here. One thing that people will do is they'll do things like this. Wait, let me get my water. 1 second. Oh, geez, my apologies. Yeah, so what they'll do is they'll do things like this. They'll have a character here. Let's say this is Staniel. And Staniel's talking about his farm. Now, he's talking about his farm, and he has to say a lot about his farm. So the artist for Staniel decides, let's put all this information in this panel. And I don't really have to explain how odd this looks, right? There's two things that happen with your word balloon in a situation like this. You want to avoid it basically because your word balloon has become so big and so intrusive, it's now literally intruding on the composition of your image, right? Your words are now rivaling your picture. And like I said in the beginning, the picture is the focus here. We're reading comic books. We're not reading novels. So the picture is always the focus. So you don't want to have word balloons that are now taking the focus off of the picture, and now it's all on this giant word balloon, not even as a word balloon, but as like an entity, as like another subject in the picture. It's like this person has a giant box next to them, and it's like a giant stone or something. Another thing that happens too is you want to keep in mind that when you're making a comic book, people are not reading novels. Like, you're reading a comic book, you're not reading a novel. You're not reading something some big Shakespearean play or something. You're reading a comic book. So what you want to do is you want to be aware of the fact that they're not, I mean, I guess Shakespearean plays would not be the best example. You're not reading like some Ayn Rand or something. You're reading a normal comic book. So you don't want to pack it with dialogue for the simple fact that that's not what the reader wants to experience. The reader is not hopping into the comic book experience just so that they can sit down and read 3 pages of dialogue, right? You want to be aware of that. You really want to be aware of that, because even though you don't want to pander to people and go like, okay, let me just break down all my dialogue so that people can have the best experience ever reading my comic book and they don't have to think at all. That may sound like an ideal, but you don't want to pander to people and like destroy your dialogue because of that. Well, what I would suggest is, instead of, packing it all in there like, a giant, I don't know, like an overfilled balloon or something, you want to find creative ways to basically break apart large sections of dialogue. So let's say Stan has to talk about his farm, right? There's a number of ways he can do that. He can talk about his farm with little spaces in between each segment he's talking about. You can even take everything he has to say about his farm and go, what is really necessary to understand about his farm? And you might realize there's a lot of things that don't actually need to be there. There's a lot of things he's saying that aren't necessary to understanding his farm or what he's trying to say, but maybe you haven't thought about it too much, so you included all of it. Right, so doing things like this is very effective if you're trying to find a way to not make a super distracting image. We can see it in use here. I wanted this character to say all this stuff, and this was a 10-page comic limit. So for the comic design, a 10 pages limit. So I had to pinch this stuff in here at the end, and I didn't really want to block any of the characters' faces. I didn't want to like have a giant word balloon. So I thought, let's just break it down into like a pattern of speech. So it was like, look, we're having a show at Kana Bar, 11 p.m. Come by and we'll check your work. That's basically like a pattern of speech. You take breaths between those things, if ever so slightly. So it seems more realistic even in that sense too, as opposed to this, which kind of seems like somebody's going, and then this and then that and that and that and this and that and that, no, because that's what this represents. It represents somebody who's just going on and on and on. So you really want to try to find a way to break it apart. You could even have little balloons or balloons that are like in different sections. So when you're putting your dialogue in, let's say I have Adrian here. He's talking, I know, but... right? I know, but. Now, I could have easily put this in there and just had a big word balloon that said, I know, but, and like a ... But would that really illustrate, would it really illustrate what I'm trying to show or what he's trying to say as clear as possible? Because keep in mind, the reader's not hearing this. So how do you show them the sound? Now, that sounds kind of weird, but how do you show them the pause, right? You can literally... you can put dots in there which show a pause, but it doesn't show a pause as good as just literally putting a pause. Meaning they read this and they literally have to wait till they get to this one. And now it's like, I know, but, as opposed to being, I know, and then maybe they read it too fast. Now it doesn't have as much of an effect. It doesn't seem as realistic in the speech. So definitely be aware of how that's working and try to find really clever ways of breaking apart your dialogue so you can avoid things like this and you don't really scare your readers away from reading your comic book. Not that you shouldn't be reading. I mean, reading is awesome, but don't, if you're making a comic book, be aware that the people are reading a comic book. They're not reading a novel. So I'm gonna end this with 2 exercises that are really effective. So the way I think about dialogue is this. The way to get really nice dialogue, and I'm not saying I have like the best dialogue, but the way to get really realistic dialogue is to talk to people. Just have conversations with a lot of people, and in particular have conversations with people that you do not know, meaning strangers. And why talk to strangers, you may ask. And I think it's here's why I've gotten out of it is that when you talk to strangers, you realize that people kind of have their own pattern of speech, meaning that everybody kind of speaks in their own way. And it's hard to realize this if you're only talking to the same people all the time. Maybe you're talking to the same friends you have all the time. And if you're talking to your friends, you all tend to talk alike, meaning you have the same patterns of speech. That's why you're friends. So if you talk to strangers, people maybe who may seem like they talk different, or people who are talking differently than you, you realize that everybody kind of has this individual way of speaking. And then when you're making your comic book, instead of having characters that all are talking exactly the same, like all these characters sound exactly the same or whatever, you can add little things, little maybe mannerisms and ways of speech that before you weren't aware of, because now you realize, okay, maybe somebody would say this. Maybe this person would end their conversation with a, right? As opposed to just ending it. I remember I was talking to a guy at a bus stop before, and he kept saying something like, he ended it with something like, that's just my experience, or something like that. But whenever he would end his sentence, he would say a particular phrase. And it's like, it's not something people, like young people, say anymore. I forgot exactly what it was, but it was something along the lines of like, that's just my experience, or something like that. And it's like, you can tell that he was very old school in the way he spoke. Now, let's say you're drawing an old school character. Now you have a reference experience to kind of draw off of and go, okay, maybe, you know, instead of drawing that old school character and having them talk like a young person, which they wouldn't do, you can make them talk like an actual adult, or maybe a person of a different time period would, because you've actually spoken to somebody of that time period, and you know that that's like, you know, people don't all talk the same. So definitely talk to a lot of strangers, get out of your comfort zone, speak to people, just say hi to people, maybe ask somebody about, you know, what they're reading, what they're doing, or I don't know, find a way to talk to random strangers. It's not that hard once you start doing it. People are surprisingly receptive to other people who are interested in them, and people who are happy and positive towards them. So as long as you're not walking to somebody and being super aggressive, you can learn a lot from talking to strangers. The next one I'd say would be to read a lot of books. So read a lot of novels, read a lot of things of that nature, because there's lots of conversations in those. So in novels, you know, there is a lot of words, but they break it up into like comic book form. They break them up into little sections. They don't have like long drawn out speeches in in novels. They have their dialogue sections. So that's going to segue basically into the very next thing that I'm going to say, and that's what the actual exercise in the Making Comics book was, and that is to basically, or one of the exercises, and that is to basically take any novel that you like, so any book that has people conversating in it, that, you know, or it can go on for like a page or so, and take that conversation and try to split it into panels. So try to illustrate that conversation as good as you possibly can, right? So literally show that conversation. And he says restrict it, or try to restrict it, or no, restrict it to basically one sentence or panel, right? Because if you can do that, then you have more freedom in your dialogue, and you can understand, okay, what works in dialogue and what destroys a page in dialogue, and you can see it for yourself. So definitely do those two things. Talk to strangers, see what people are actually like, so you don't end up drawing like static dialogue that everybody sounds the same. And then read a lot of novels and things like that where people are having conversations, and there's like people who spent their entire life, you know, writing conversations, so obviously they know what they're doing. So that's basically it for this video. Comment down below with any comic books or anything of that nature that you feel has excellent dialogue, and any examples you feel have destroyed their comic book because of faulty dialogue. I'd be super happy to know and discuss it with you down below in the comment section. So comment any of that stuff down below. Right now I'm waving my finger down to the comment section, even though you can't see it. That's happening. And then like and subscribe if you really enjoyed this video. I want to thank you guys for watching. There's going to be one more video coming up very soon. But yeah, thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. And this is ScorchArtist. Peace out.